The rain poured mercilessly over the city of Boston, turning sidewalks into rivers and the air into a curtain of sorrow, as Ethan Prescott gripped the wheel of his obsidian black Range Rover with a clenched jaw and a heart weighed down by memories too painful to name. Lightning tore the sky in half, echoing the storm that had long been raging inside him. A storm born of betrayal, of broken promises, of parents who chose power over their own son, who left him to navigate the cold corridors of wealth with no compass but his own wounded pride. His blue eyes, once full of warmth, were now oceans of ice, hiding depths even he dared not explore. And though the world saw a millionaire in a tailored suit and pristine reputation, inside he was a man starved for something real, something unfiltered, something unspoken. That night, fate, perhaps moved by pity or irony, unveiled its plan as he turned down a narrow, dimly lit alley, tires slicing through puddles like blades. And just as his mind swirled with the ghosts of his past, he saw her. A crumpled figure collapsed on the drenched concrete, her frame barely visible beneath the storm's fury. Without hesitation, instinct louder than fear, Ethan slammed on the brakes, water splashing violently as he threw open the door and ran toward her, his breath catching when he saw her face. Pale, beautiful, and bruised like a porcelain angel cast down into a world too cruel for innocence. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her soaked clothes clinging to her like a second skin. And when he touched her wrist, searching for a pulse, it was weak but fighting, like her. He didn't know her name, her story, or what brought her to the edge of collapse on a forgotten street. But something deeper than logic told him to save her. Her, and without another thought, he scooped her into his arms, shielding her with his coat, cradling her like something fragile the world had tried to shatter. The car ride was silent except for the heavy beating of his heart and the raindrops drumming against the roof like an orchestra of dread. And when he reached his penthouse, a tower of glass and gold overlooking a city he no longer felt a part of, he carried her through the elevator, past polished marble, into a space that had never known vulnerability until that very moment. Laying her gently on the velvet couch near the fireplace, he wrapped her in thick blankets, his hands shaking as he tried to dry her damp hair, wondering why he cared so much for a stranger. Hours passed in a hush, broken only by the crackling of fire and the occasional gasp of her shallow breath. And when she finally stirred, eyelids fluttering open as if waking from a nightmare, her gaze collided with his. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt seen. Startled, she sat up abruptly, eyes wide with terror, her voice a whisper, hoarse with fear, as she clutched the blanket tighter around her. "Who are you? Where am I?" she asked, her body recoiling like a wounded animal expecting pain. Ethan, kneeling beside her, raised his hands in calm. "You collapsed. I found you in the alley. You're safe now. I promise." Her lips trembled as if even the word safe was foreign to her ears. She looked around at the luxurious surroundings, then back at him, as if wondering whether she'd woken up in a dream or a trap. And then finally, in the smallest voice, she whispered, "My name is Lila." Just that. No last name, no story, just a name drenched in mystery. Her green eyes were deep wells of sadness, as if they'd witnessed too much for someone so young. And though her face was beautiful, it was her silence that struck Ethan most. It screamed louder than words, told tales of nights she never wanted to remember. As she shifted, the blanket slipped slightly, revealing faint bruises along her collarbone. And instinctively, she pulled it back up, shame flashing across her face. Ethan didn't ask questions. He simply handed her a glass of water and sat across from her, quietly observing. Her hands trembled as she drank, and for a moment, he wondered how many times she'd been let down before. How many people saw her suffering and walked away. He wasn't going to be one of them. Not this time. There was a quiet war happening in the room, hers to hide, his to understand. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. He didn't know what role she would play in his life, but somehow he knew she wasn't just another storm passing through. She was the calm and the chaos, the wound and the remedy, the stranger whose presence would either save him or destroy what was left of him. The silence between them settled like mist, gentle but heavy, wrapping the room in something unspoken. And as Ethan sat across from Lila in the golden flicker of firelight, he felt as though he were witnessing a flower trying to bloom in the dead of winter, delicate, hesitant, and unsure if it would survive the frost. The clock ticked softly in the background, its rhythm contrasting the chaotic thoughts in his head. And though he longed to ask her who she was running from, what haunted her so deeply that her body carried echoes of it in every movement, he held his tongue, understanding that sometimes silence is the kindest language. Lila rarely spoke unless she had to, but there were moments when she sipped tea, when her eyes traced the city lights beyond the penthouse windows, where Ethan could see words lingering on her lips, too afraid to become sound. He offered her comfort without intrusion, clean clothes, warm meals, the softest guest room that overlooked the skyline, and even little things, a handwritten note reminding her she was safe, a small tray of chocolates left outside her door. Not because he wanted to win her trust, but because something inside him ached to see her unafraid. Days passed like that, each one quiet but profound, like living inside a paused breath, and yet every interaction between them carried a gravity that made Ethan forget about board meetings, deadlines, and the glamorous distractions of his world. Then came the night everything shifted. The storm had returned, rain hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows as if trying to break in. And Ethan was up late, reading a manuscript he had no interest in, when he heard it, a scream, sharp and strangled, slicing through the silence like a knife. He rushed to her room, heart pounding as he burst through the door, and there she was, sitting upright in bed, drenched in sweat, clutching the blanket to her chest, her breath ragged, her eyes wild like a deer caught in headlights. "It's okay. You're safe," he whispered, gently approaching her, his voice low and calm. But her shoulders shook as if she couldn't hear anything over the screams of her memory. The sheets beneath her were soaked, not from the storm, but from the terror that lived inside her bones. And without hesitation, he reached for the drawer, pulling out a fresh robe, holding it out as if offering peace. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him, wide-eyed, her fingers trembling. "Lila," he said softly, "you're safe here. Let me help." She nodded slowly, almost robotically, and he stepped closer, unfastening the buttons of her damp shirt. Not with desire, but with care, his hands trembling more than hers, not from temptation, but from the realization that she was far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. Her skin, though flawless, bore silent stories, tiny scars near her ribs, faint bruises along her arms, as if pain had been a routine, not an event. But when he reached the last button, her body stiffened like a wire pulled too tight, and she turned her head away, a tear slipping down her cheek, and then, barely audible, like a confession to the wind, she whispered, "No one's ever touched me, not even once." Time seemed to stop. Ethan froze, hands suspended in the air, heart caught somewhere between heartbreak and disbelief. He stepped back instantly, averting his eyes, suddenly ashamed of the world that had failed her so deeply that even kindness felt threatening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, placing the robe on the bed and turning away, giving her space as she clutched it against her chest like armor. She didn't cry, not the way most would. Her pain was quiet, private, pressed down so deep it only escaped in moments like this. That night, they didn't share a bed, didn't exchange declarations or promises, but something shifted irreversibly between them, a silent pact, a thread of understanding spun not from romance, but from raw, unvarnished truth. Later, when she stepped into the living room wearing the oversized robe, hair damp, eyes still swollen, Ethan simply nodded at her, and she nodded back, a wordless acknowledgement that something deeper than words had just taken root. They sat side by side on the couch, not touching, but not distant either, their bodies close enough to feel each other's presence. And in that sacred quiet, Ethan realized that sometimes the most intimate thing you can give someone is safety. Not passion, not poetry, just the space to exist without fear. Lila leaned her head against the cushion, exhausted beyond measure, and Ethan sat still as stone, watching the rain fall, knowing this night would be etched into both their lives. Not because of what did happen, but because of what didn't. The night after their wordless bond was formed, something began to shift inside Lila, like a rusted door creaking open after years of being locked tight. And while she still flinched at sudden sounds and slept with one eye half open, a softness had begun blooming around her edges. She no longer looked like someone who expected to vanish. Ethan noticed it in the way she lingered in the kitchen a little longer, the way she asked about his day in a whisper, like it was a foreign phrase she was still learning to pronounce. And in those quiet exchanges over coffee or beneath the low hum of jazz from the old record player, trust slowly found its roots. One afternoon, as the sunlight spilled through the tall windows and painted golden lines across the hardwood floors, Lila finally spoke, not in fragmented phrases, but with a steady voice that trembled only at the edges. "I'm running from someone," she confessed, her fingers curled around a mug of untouched tea. Ethan didn't push, didn't interrupt, just waited because he knew some truths are like wounds. You can't force them open. Someone who has power, enough to ruin lives, enough to erase people. Her eyes didn't meet his, but her voice carried the weight of truths too big for her small frame. Ethan's heart clenched. He wanted to protect her, to offer safety beyond walls and wealth, but even as he promised himself he'd never let harm near her again, fate had its own cruel timing. Just as trust was being planted, Miranda Prescott returned. His mother, fierce, elegant, and colder than the marble floors she once walked on in designer heels. She hadn't spoken to Ethan in years, not since the family fractured under political disgrace and scandal, but when she stepped into his office uninvited, her presence sucked the air from the room. "Stay away from that girl," she said, her voice sharp enough to shatter glass. Ethan, startled, narrowed his eyes. "You don't get to walk in after years and tell me who I can be around." Miranda's lips curled in bitter restraint. "Lila Montgomery," she hissed, like the name itself was venom. "Her father destroyed our family. Don't let her finish what he started." The name struck Ethan like a bolt through his spine. Montgomery. Joseph Montgomery. The very man who once tried to frame Ethan's father in a political corruption scandal that nearly cost them everything. A man whose ambition knew no moral restraint, whose lies buried reputations and clawed into headlines like wildfire. Ethan's pulse thundered as memories resurfaced. Courtrooms, headlines, his father's hollowed face as he fought to clear his name. And now Lila, sweet, silent Lila, was his daughter. His instinct screamed denial, but logic whispered confirmation. The timelines, the secrecy, the fear in her eyes. It all aligned like a cruel puzzle. But as the truth settled like frost on his skin, Ethan made a choice. He wouldn't judge her by her bloodline. Lila wasn't her father. She had saved nothing for herself, carried no trace of power or manipulation. If anything, she bore the cost of someone else's crimes. So he buried the truth, for now stuffed it into the shadows of his mind, fearing that exposing it might fracture what little peace she had begun to find. But what Ethan didn't know was that Lila already knew. She always knew. From the very first time she saw his face, she recognized the surname, the legacy, the family entangled with hers in a mess of scandal and blame. She had hoped he wouldn't find out, had clung to the naive belief that she could start anew, that history wouldn't catch up with her in a penthouse built by the son of her father's greatest enemy. But as Ethan continued treating her with kindness, trust, and moments of rare vulnerability, the guilt began to bloom like poison ivy around her heart. Every laugh they shared, every quiet moment of connection, became tainted by the secret she was too afraid to say aloud. Her chest ached not just from what she'd been through, but from the invisible knife of deception she carried every day. And every time he looked at her with those ocean blue eyes full of silent care, she felt her lies crack louder. He deserved the truth. He deserved more than the girl with the haunted eyes and the bloodlines she wished she could erase. But every time she opened her mouth to tell him, the words clung to her throat like barbed wire. What would he do when he knew? Would he see her as just another Montgomery, a shadow of betrayal? Or would the fragile thread that bound them snap under the weight of blood and legacy? As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling where the city lights danced like fading hope, she realized the silence between them wasn't safety anymore. It was a lie stretching thin, and it would bleed soon. Lila lay wide awake the next morning, her fingers tangled in the hotel's soft white sheets, eyes burning from a night of silent tears. But before the sun could fully rise over Boston's skyline, Ethan surprised her with a plan that felt like a breath of fresh air. Their first escape together, away from shadows, away from secrets. Vermont. Snow-kissed mountains, pine-scented cabins, fireside silence. Something far from the haunted pace of their daily lives. She agreed, though her heart thudded with quiet fear, for she knew time was running out on the truth she hadn't yet confessed. The drive was quiet, their hands brushing in the center console, a touch that said more than words. And when they arrived at the secluded lodge nestled in the woods, it felt like entering another world, one where pain hadn't yet planted roots. That weekend Lila bloomed. She laughed, not nervously but freely, like the weight of her past couldn't climb this high into the mountains. She danced barefoot on the icy deck, wrapped in one of Ethan's oversized sweaters, her breath fogging in the crisp air as snowflakes clung to her lashes. They cooked together, badly, flour smudging her cheek and sticking to his shirt as they giggled over burnt pancakes. By the fire she spoke of books she loved, places she dreamed to see, things no one had ever cared enough to ask. And Ethan listened, every word carving itself into the spaces of his heart he thought were long frozen over. He watched her unwrap herself, layer by layer, not just in stories but in spirit, and for the first time, he saw her not as a mystery to solve, but as a soul to cherish. He was falling, not in lust, not in curiosity, but in something terrifying and beautiful, something that made the world blur except for her. But love, it seems, always invites the storm. On their final night, wrapped in woolen blankets by the fireplace, sipping wine and listening to the crackle of logs, the door swung open, not with the chill of winter, but the cold fury of fate. Miranda Prescott stood there, immaculate in her fury, eyes scanning the cozy scene with disgust. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, though the answer was already in her voice. Ethan rose, confused, cautious, but before he could speak, Miranda launched the truth like a dagger. "She's Joseph Montgomery's daughter, the same man who almost sent your father to prison, the same man who humiliated our family." Her words echoed like gunfire in the quiet room, and the color drained from Ethan's face. He turned to Lila, as if hoping for denial, for a shake of the head, for one saving lie. But Lila didn't run, didn't hide, didn't scream. She stood there like a fallen angel, silent, eyes glistening with betrayal and shame, her breath trembling in the space between them. "I didn't want to lie," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I just didn't want to lose you." And in that moment, all the warmth they'd built collapsed into frost. Ethan's eyes, once filled with adoration, now burned with disbelief, and his chest tightened as if his ribs were being crushed by invisible hands. The betrayal wasn't in her blood, it was in her silence. "You already did," he said, his voice colder than any snow outside. The pain behind his words was deeper than anger. It was heartbreak, raw and unforgiving. Lila opened her mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to beg, but no sound came. What was there to say when the truth had already exploded in the room? Her heart crumbled beneath the weight of everything she feared would happen. And just like that, as snow began to fall again outside the window, painting the world in white silence, she stepped back. Not because she wanted to, but because she knew staying would only make him bleed more. The door closed behind her, like the end of a song neither of them wanted to stop. Vermont was no longer their escape. It had become the graveyard of something almost beautiful, buried in a storm of truth, too late to survive. The days turned into weeks, and while the city moved on, Ethan found himself frozen in time, surrounded by boardroom meetings, deadlines, and walls that once made him feel powerful, but now only echoed with her absence. Her voice no longer hummed in the kitchen, her laughter no longer floated through the penthouse, and even the silence had changed. It sounded more like regret now. He buried himself in work, convincing everyone, including himself, that he was fine, that losing her was necessary, But behind every contract signed and every late-night whiskey sip, her memory clung to him like a ghost, soft, aching, and persistent. Then one evening, during a high-profile hospital fundraiser filled with Boston's elite, while shaking hands and nodding through small talk, Ethan's eyes locked onto a familiar figure in the corner, not dressed in glamour but in quiet grace, folding paper cranes with children whose heads were bald from chemotherapy. Lila. His breath caught. She was thinner now, her frame fragile beneath a simple white blouse. And though she smiled gently at the children, her eyes were oceans, wide, distant, and full of sadness. He stood still, watching her for a moment, torn between guilt and longing, then slowly approached, each step heavy with memories. "Lila," he said softly, his voice nearly lost in the hum of the event. She turned and their eyes met, her breath catching, and in that instant, the weight of everything unsaid hovered between them. "I'm sorry," he murmured, eyes glistening. "I didn't fight for you. I should have believed in you." She blinked fast, trying to hold back the tears that rose like waves. "I didn't deserve you," she whispered. "I just wanted to be loved without fear." Outside, under a velvet sky littered with stars, they sat side by side on a quiet bench, wrapped in a silence that felt more like music. The night air was crisp, but neither noticed. Ethan reached for her hand, and when she didn't pull away, he held it gently, as if holding a wounded bird. "I don't care who your father was," he said, his voice low and sure. "I care about the girl who lit up my home with her presence, the girl who taught me how to feel again." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Ethan brushed it away with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "And I care about the man who saved me when I was at my lowest," she whispered. They sat for hours talking, not about politics or betrayals, but about poetry, childhood dreams, and second chances. And when the sky deepened and the world quieted around them, their foreheads touched, not in passion, but in peace. That night in the privacy of Ethan's home, they didn't rush, didn't hunger, didn't surrender to impulse. Instead, they undressed pain with words, unwrapped wounds with patience, and kissed not with fire, but with reverence. There was no lust, no urgency, only the slow unraveling of two broken hearts, stitching themselves back together. Lila rested her head on his chest, listening to the heartbeat that once pushed her away now pull her close. Ethan whispered promises, not dramatic ones but real ones like, "I'm here and I won't let go this time." Her fingers found his, and their hands fit like they were made for each other, every movement soft, every breath shared. It was a night of untouched love, where emotion held more power than desire, where scars were seen and still accepted, where two souls stopped pretending and simply rested, in understanding, in forgiveness, in hope. The world outside could burn, fall, or scream, but in that small space of whispered truths and tender glances, Ethan and Lila found a kind of peace that no money, no legacy, no bloodline could ever buy. And for the first time, love didn't demand. It healed. It didn't consume. It cherished. It didn't destroy. It rebuilt. In that sacred silence, their souls, once scarred and scared, finally touched, fully, freely, and forever. Just as Ethan and Lila began to breathe in the fragile peace they'd stitched together, as love started to bloom in soft glances and unspoken forgiveness, the world shifted again. This time not with a scream, but with the quiet slap of an envelope on Ethan's marble floor. Hand-delivered with no return address, only Lila's name scrawled in fading ink that trembled as much as her hands did when she picked it up. Her breath caught as she recognized the handwriting, her father's, and the seal cracked like an old wound reopening. They read it together by the window where morning light poured in like truth, and each word was a dagger wrapped in sorrow. In his dying confession, Joseph Montgomery bared his soul, revealing that the scandal, the disgrace, the years of pain he'd endured hadn't begun with corruption or ambition, but with fear and Miranda Prescott. He had been blackmailed into framing Ethan's father to protect secrets that weren't his. Miranda's affair with a married senator, a scandal that could have destroyed the Prescott empire if it ever surfaced. Miranda, elegant and ruthless, had used leverage to bury her mistake, and in doing so, buried two families in ashes. Every punishment Lila suffered, every shadow she grew up under, every insult, bruise, and escape, it hadn't been her father's sins, but his silence, twisted by another's lies. Lila clutched the letter as tears streamed down her cheeks, not because she forgave too easily, but because she finally understood the war her father had fought behind closed doors. He hadn't been perfect, but he had loved her. And in the end, he tried to protect her the only way he knew how, by carrying the weight of a lie that wasn't his. Ethan, heart pounding and hands cold, drove straight to his mother's estate without a word. The confrontation was thunderous, emotionally, not violently. "Tell me it's not true," he demanded, holding out the letter like a mirror she couldn't avoid. Miranda stood frozen, pearls around her neck, lips trembling. "I did what I had to do," she finally whispered. "Our name, our legacy. I couldn't let one mistake ruin us." Her voice cracked, and for the first time in years, Ethan saw something other than control in her eyes. Remorse. "I never thought it would destroy your father. Or her." She sat down slowly, her hands shaking. "I only wanted to protect you, but I guess I protected the wrong things." Ethan didn't yell. The silence between them was louder than any argument, heavy with the weight of every broken truth now laid bare. Back at the penthouse, Lila still held the letter, reading it over and over as though her father's voice could be heard between the lines. "He was trying to save me," she whispered, as Ethan returned and knelt beside her, his hand over hers. "All this time, I thought I was the daughter of a villain, but he was a victim too." They didn't speak for a while, just sat in the quiet glow of evening, surrounded by the echoes of the past. The pain was real, but so was the clarity. The betrayal was never hers to carry. It belonged to the generation before them, the ones who played with power and pride while their children paid the price. Now the truth had arrived, not to destroy them, but to set them free. Ethan stood outside the cottage in Maine, the crisp air laced with the scent of lilacs and salt water, his breath catching as he spotted her figure beneath the soft glow of twilight, tending to a small garden that seemed more metaphor than earth. Flowers sprouting among weeds, life blooming despite storms, much like her. Lila's back was to him, unaware of his presence, her hands cradling a wilted rose as though nurturing it back to life was her penance or her prayer. He took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes as memories pressed around him. The weight of their shared grief, the silence of their separations, the ache of everything they never got to say. When she turned, startled, their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them like wind through the trees. An apology, a longing, a question. Ethan didn't speak right away. Instead, he pulled something from his coat pocket. Not a diamond, not a grand gesture the world would expect from a man like him, but a simple, gleaming key. He knelt, not with fanfare but with sincerity, and held it out with trembling hands and a voice heavy with all he'd finally learned. "To our new life," he said, eyes not leaving hers, "if you'll still have me." Lila stood frozen for a heartbeat that felt like eternity, tears spilling down her cheeks as she stepped closer, her fingers brushing his as she took the key like it was made of gold. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered, her voice breaking in all the right places. And in that single moment, all the betrayals, the heartbreaks, the sins of their parents, and the years they'd both suffered under the shadows of other people's choices, none of it mattered anymore. The past no longer had power over them. What had once chained them in pain had led them to this clearing, to this quiet place where forgiveness and hope could finally breathe. He rose slowly and their foreheads met first, tenderly, as though they were remembering how to exist in each other's arms. When their lips touched, it was not the heat of passion that ignited, but the calm warmth of home, of knowing, of being found after being lost for so long. That kiss held every broken piece, every aching silence, every buried hope and whispered prayer, and it stitched them back together, not as who they were, but as who they had become. The wind blew through the garden, carrying with it the scent of spring and the quiet promise of a life they would now build together. Not as survivors of chaos, but as co-creators of peace. Ethan took her hand and placed it over his heart, where it beat like a vow, and she smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because they had earned this imperfect, beautiful forever. No ceremony, no stage, just two souls that had clawed their way through darkness to finally stand in the light. And as they stood beneath the stars, those same stars that once bore witness to their unraveling, they now bore witness to a healing so deep it touched even the past. The garden no longer looked like a place of grief. It looked like a beginning. And when Ethan whispered, "Let's go home," it wasn't to a place, it was to her.